Hello, everyone, and welcome to the UPPAA Fall Virtual Conference. My name is Victor Volkman. I'm the current president of the Upper Peninsula Publishers and Authors Association, or UPPAA as we call it. You can learn more about our organization at www.uppaa.org. And tonight we have with us Tyler Tichelaar, the 7th generation Marquette resident, who will be giving our presentation on researching and writing your history book or historical novel. He holds a PhD in literature from Western Michigan University and a bachelor and master's degrees in English from NMU. He has an avid interest in UP history and genealogy, which led him to writing both UP historical fiction and nonfiction. Today, he is considered a local expert on Marquette history. Tyler's first novel, Iron Pioneers, which was the first of the Marquette Trilogy, arrived in 2006. And in 2011, he was awarded the Marquette County Outstanding Writer Award and the Barb Kelly Award for Historical Preservation for his efforts to promote Marquette history, following the production of his book, My Marquette. And you can learn more about him at www.marquettefiction.com. And over to you, Tyler.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and thank you for the introduction, Victor. I'll just back up for a minute, back to my bio, and tell you a little bit about myself, my interest in history. Like Victor said, I'm a 7th generation resident of Marquette. My mom's family came here in 1849, which was the year Marquette was founded, and I'm actually a 7th generation on 2 sides of her family. And then on my dad's family is French-Canadian, part of it. And they actually, one of my ancestors was Nicholas Perot, who was a voyager and traveled with the Jesuits, translating for them, and became governor of the Wisconsin territories back in like 1690, 1700, somewhere back there. So I've got my UP roots go way, way back. And so I became interested in local history, mainly from growing up in Marquette and hearing stories about Marquette from my grandpa, and him telling me things about when he was a kid and telling me stories that were passed down from his parents and grandparents. And then after my grandparents died, I became really interested in genealogy and just asking myself the question, like, what is this weird twist of fate that resulted in my being born in Marquette? And of course, it's because my parents were here, and of course their parents before them, and back until I came to the realization through doing research that it's because of the discovery of the iron ore in Negaunee. One of my ancestors was Basil Bishop, who had an iron forge out in New York. And he came to Marquette in 1850 because he was absolutely determined to come and see this wonderful iron ore that he had heard all these wonderful stories about. And when he got here, he managed to attract several other relatives to the area. And we have some letters that are at the Marquette Regional History Center that he wrote back home to relatives in New York, talking about how wonderful the UP is, what a wonderful climate there is here, believe it or not, and how you can grow anything here, including sugarcane that is 6 feet high. So he liked to joke a bit, as you can tell, but he was really kind of like the first, almost like self-named Chamber of Commerce or something for Marquette, and these letters that he wrote trying to get people to come. And he did actually, he and his wife, they had 18 children. 4 of them did come to Marquette. His wife's nephew came, his son-in-law's sister and her family came. And so he really did attract a lot of people to the area. And so I just have always had this connection to the area as a result. And so early on, I started writing fiction set in the UP. The first thing I wrote was a short story called The Ghost of Stonegate Woods, which I wrote when I was in 8th grade, and it was set back in the 1800s in the UP. And then the next book I wrote was supposed to become a biography of, like a fictional biography of my grandpa, though it went way off far afield and became its own thing. And then finally, when I was in, well, I graduated from NMU with my bachelor's and master's in English, and I always knew I wanted to be a writer. But of course I had to support myself also, and I wrote novels and I sent them out to publishers thinking I would get published, I would become famous overnight and not have to work. Well, that didn't work out. So I realized I had to go into I was going to go into teaching. I went down to Western to get my PhD in English. And it was while I was down there that I decided to write a series of novels that became the Marquette Trilogy. It was the year 1999, which was the sesquicentennial in Marquette. And so that was the year that I had this idea to write this series of books about Marquette. And my intention was to write one novel that would cover 150 years of Marquette's history. And it started out with this book, Iron Pioneers, but what happened is that there was just so much history, so much interest in history about the area that I soon realized my one novel was going to become 3 novels. And it did, and they're each about 190 to 200,000 words apiece. So almost 600,000 words about Marquette's history and fiction. And that's probably enough about me, but I'm gonna, I have some slides here of some of my book covers just so you can kind of see the different kinds of historical related projects that I've done over the years. So this first, that first slide, the Marquette Trilogy is, those are very, they're fictional. It's historical fiction, but they are very history focused novels. Like I said, each one covers 150 years of Marquette's history. All the events in the novels are historical. You know, I have scenes built around the fire of 1868 that burned Marquette down, scenes around the blizzard of 1938, scenes about, you know, how Marquette dealt with the Civil War, World War II, all these actual historical events. The main characters are all fictional, but a lot of historical people are woven into the storyline, like Bishop Baraga, Peter White, who's one of Marquette's early philanthropists, Chief Kabagum, who was the Ojibwa chief here. And so I weave all these historical people into the storyline, and they interact with my fictional characters to try to make the fiction feel like actual history. And so it's very history focused in that I'm tracing the course of Marquette's history over the decades. Now, if you go on to the next slide, let me see. No, can you go back, Victor? I'm sorry. The Spirit of the North slide. Okay, this book is also historical fiction, but it's more character-based. It's set back in the 1870s, but other than the fact that it's set back in the past, it's not really about history, it's about the characters. It's about 2 sisters who come up to Marquette in the 1870s. They've come to live with their uncle because their family their parents have died, and so they've come to live with their uncle. They get here, they find out their uncle has also died, and they have no money, so they have to spend the winter living in their uncle's cabin out in the woods. And so it's not really about historical events at all. It's just about what happens to them in this historical time period. You can see the subtitle is a paranormal romance. That's because there's a ghost in the story. There's some hints at possible reincarnation. There's automatic writing that comes into the story. So it's an example of character-based fiction. It's also a little bit of an example of blending the genres, what you can do with blending historical fiction with other genres. I forgot to put a slide in here of some of my other books, but I've also written a lot of historical fantasy. I have a series called The Children of Arthur, which is about King Arthur and his descendants. No one knows if King Arthur was a historical person or not. We believe he probably was, but he's not the glorious monarch that is depicted in most of the films today. So I had a lot of fun with that, just sort of making up the historical record, but at the same time drawing on historical facts from the time period. My series runs actually throughout the Middle Ages, and so I did a lot of research on people like Charlemagne, for example, who's one of the characters in one of the later books in the series. So those are some examples of historical fiction I've written. And then Victor, if you want to go on to the next one. This is I would call this one an example of straightforward history, though even there it's a little bit of a stretch to say that. After I wrote my historical fiction books, the bookstores in Marquette told me, well, what we really want is an actual history of Marquette. That's what the tourists keep asking for, and there aren't any in print anymore. And I kept not really wanting to do it because I thought it'd be kind of boring to write just a regular history of Marquette, and also rather daunting to try to figure out a chronological way to tell the whole story. And so I decided to write this book, which rather than, starting in 1849 and working its way up to the present, instead tells the history of Marquette through the different buildings in Marquette. So as you read through the book, you get the history of the downtown, and the downtown is divided up into, say, the First National Bank, the Savings Bank, Donkers, the Dell Theater, the Old City Hall. So you see all the buildings on the front cover there. Those are all places where I tell the individual story of each of those places. And then I want to also make it kind of a personal book. So it's kind of a memoir in some ways. So I talk about my own connection to each of these buildings, like either my memories associated with that building, or ways that my family was connected to that building, or I quote passages from my novels and talk about how I use those buildings in my novels. So I tried to kind of blend different things there, but for the most part, it's a regular history book. And then if you want to go on the next slide, Victor. And then in 2013, the Marquette Regional History Center asked me if I would write a play. And this play, Willpower, was the result of that. They had the idea for the story. They wanted a play about Will Adams, who, as you can see, was Marquette's ossified man. He had what was called ossification, which was where the tissues in his body hardened until they became like stone and he couldn't walk. But he was a very artistic and creative person, and very determined to get every inch of life out that he possibly could. And so this play is his life story. It was produced at the Marquette Regional History, at Kaufman Auditorium by the Marquette Regional History Center. And then I came out with the book version of it. So there are photos in the book of different events. The main character is historical, an actual person, but I had to do a lot of research about him, read his letters and his plays that he wrote, and things about the family to create this play. Though it could just as well have been a novel, actually. And then go on to the next slide. Okay, and then I wrote this book, which is well, Haunted Marquette, Ghost Stories, but I wanted to get at the truth of ghost stories about Marquette, so I did a lot of research. So this one is a nonfiction book. There's a lot of research into the history of the different buildings in Marquette that are supposedly haunted, and then I kind of make some suggestions about who the ghosts could be based on events that happened at those various places. And this book has been extremely popular. I figured it would be, which is why I wrote it. I figured if I don't write it, somebody else is going to write it. So I did. But what surprised me is that even though people buy it because they're interested in ghosts, a lot of people tell me that what they find most interesting about it is the history. in the book, the history about the different places and the stories about the people who are historical, who, you know, now may or may not have become ghosts. And then the next slide, Victor. And then this is my newest book, and this is the one I'm going to kind of talk the most about tonight. This is a biography of Chief Kabagum, who was the local Ojibwa chief here in Marquette. He's buried out at Presque Isle Park. And this one is just very clearly a biography. I did an enormous amount of research for this book. I spent like 3 years on it. I have over, I don't know, between 200 and 300 sources for it. It's about 400 some pages long. And it'll be released on November 18th. I'll be having a book release party through the History Center, and it looks like it'll be a Zoom presentation like this one is right now. Victor, if you want to go on to the next slide, I'll just talk a little bit. I'm going to talk mostly about writing history, but I'll throw in fiction as well in the process, and just kind of give you some ideas of how I do things. And I'm going to say up front, I am a very low-tech person. I don't get too involved in technology-related things on the computer. I kind of do things the old-fashioned way. So you may want to do things a different way, but I'm just going to walk you through my process, and hopefully that will give you some ideas. I think, of course, the first thing you have to do is come up with an idea for what your book is going to be about. Now, if you're writing a history book, I recommend that you make an outline. Even if you write a novel, I would recommend that you make an outline. I think making an outline will help you narrow down your topic. I mean, I knew that I wanted to write a book about Chief Kabagum. I had that idea and I stuck with that idea, but you may be interested in writing about Native Americans, but you need to narrow it down. And so you may decide to narrow it down to writing about the Ojibwa, and then you may narrow that down into writing about the Ojibwa in the 20th century, or you know, something like that. So try to narrow down your topic, make an outline. Something that most authors I find, because I'm also a book editor, and so I usually have authors sending me manuscripts to edit, but they never think to write anything up for their back cover. And so one of the first things I have them do is write text for their back cover, because I think it really helps you also narrow down your focus and realize what your book is going to be about. And you can always go back and amend it later. But I think if you can write up a description that would go on the back cover of your book for about 250 words, that will help you a lot in just kind of determining what your book is about. And then the next thing is to go out and read everything you possibly can about the topic. I would start out with reading books, you know, books on the topic, and then just kind of narrow it down from there. So in writing about Chief Kabagum, the first thing I did was I went out and I read books about the Ojibwa. I read books about the UP in the 19th century, and which is in Chief Kabagum's time frame. He lived supposedly from 1799 to 1902. If you read the book, I discuss why I don't think he could possibly have been born in 1799. I don't think he was that old, but that was the time period that I knew my book was going to cover. And so I read everything that I could that I thought would be relevant to Chief Kabagum, that definitely everything that had to do with the Ojibwa in the area, but also with the settlement of the UP. He lived at a time when the Sulaks were being built. He was here when Marquette was founded. You know, he lived through the period when the UP was bought by the American government. And so all of those things were of importance to me. And I have on there, don't overlook anything. Even books you don't think will be relevant may turn out to be so. So for example, here in Marquette at the Peter White Public Library, one of the books that they had there was a book of baptism records from St. Mary's Parish in Sault Ste. Marie. And I did not think that book, I knew that book existed. It never occurred to me to really pay much attention to it. I figured he probably wasn't baptized. I knew that he was buried. He had his funeral at St. Peter's Cathedral. So I knew he was converted to Catholicism, but I didn't think much about looking at baptism records. And then I went to the Sioux to do research, and at the Lake Superior State University library, the woman there, the librarian there who helped me, she said, well, did you look at this book of these baptism records? And I said, well, yeah, I know it exists. And she said, well, I think you should take a look at it. And so I did. And lo and behold, there are baptism records of Chief Kabagum's siblings. And so that told me that his family was Catholic at a very early point. We didn't have one for him, but his younger siblings who were born in the 1830s, there were baptism records for. And so that told me that he probably grew up being Catholic, or else he became Catholic at a relatively young age. So that really helped me understand him better. So, you really want to take a look at things. I mean, there were lots of books that I looked at that turned out to be completely of no use to me, but you don't know until you've looked at them. So try to exhaust all the resources possible. And then my next point is, don't be a closet writer. Now, when I first started writing back in high school, in college, I was a closet writer. I did not tell anybody I was writing novels, because I had told a few people I wanted to be a writer, and they said to me, oh, well, it's really hard to get into writing. It's really hard to get a book published. And so I just quit telling people, because I didn't want to listen to negative feedback. And I think if you're writing novels, that's fine. You can keep it to yourself till you're ready to share it with the world. I figured I would wait until I published my bestseller, and then the whole world would be like, wow, he's a best-selling author. And then I could tell everybody I was a writer, but it doesn't work that way. So especially if you're writing a book that has history as a topic, I would very much say, go out and talk to people. Now, that doesn't mean you go over to your next door neighbor and you say, hey, I'm writing this history book. And they would probably say, oh, wow, well, that's got to be really hard. Something that is not going to be helpful to you. But you may want to go and contact, someone in the history department at Michigan Tech or Northern Michigan University or wherever, who's an expert in your subject matter, and talk to them about your project, because they will provide you with resources. In my case, with writing the book about Kabagum, I talked to people in the history department at NMU. I talked to people at the Center for Native American Studies. I talked to a lot of people at the Marquette Regional History Center. I talked to people at the Ojibwe Learning Center in Sault Ste. Marie. I had correspondence with the University of Rochester, because there was a anthropologist here in Marquette whose papers are at the University of Rochester. So I had to contact them and talk to them about my project. So, you want to talk to as many people as possible, and they will send you off in directions. And you would be surprised where you get information from. For example, one of my cousins, I mentioned to her that I was writing a book about Chief Kabagum, and she told me how her grandmother on another side of the family had told her that one time she had been riding on the streetcar in Marquette, and Chief Kabagum was on the same streetcar with her, and she dropped her purse, and Chief Kabagum picked up the purse and handed it to her. Now, it's a cute little story, but what was interesting to me is that told me that Chief Kabagum rode on the streetcar. And I figured he probably did, but I didn't know for sure that he did. And that's significant because the streetcar went out to Presque Isle Park where he lived. And I figured by the time he was like 80 years old, he probably wasn't walking to Marquette from Presque Isle and back. So it was nice to know that, yes, he was riding the streetcar. That was probably his primary form of transportation to Marquette and back in the 1890s or 1900 after the streetcar line went up. So you never know who's going to give you a little tidbit. Other people told me things that were, rumors, And I tried to investigate them and they got me nowhere, or I had to decide it's probably not true. There's no evidence to support this, but other times it turns out that there is some nugget of truth to rumors that you hear from people. So it's all worth investigating. And then last year I have visit the places that you write about, whether writing history or fiction, or if not possible, look at pictures and maps. I love doing that. And with the Chief Caboggum book, I went to the Sioux and I drove around and I looked at a lot of the historical homes, like the Henry Schoolcraft home is there at the Sioux. Schoolcraft was at the Sioux at the same time Caboggum was. Caboggum probably knew Schoolcraft. If not, his family definitely knew Schoolcraft. He was part of the Crane clan at the Sioux, which was the leading clan in the Ojibwa tribe. And so these people at the Sioux's houses are still there. He definitely would have known them, or at least have known of them, and things that they did. Henry Schoolcraft, the Johnston family that was at the Sioux, Bishop Barriga's house is there at the Sioux. I mean, these were all people who, if they did not have direct contact with him, were doing things, making decisions that definitely affected the Ojibwa people, and so therefore affected him. So going and seeing those places really, made the story come alive for me. In terms of writing fiction, same thing. You want to be able to accurately describe the places that you're writing about as much as possible. And so when I wrote my historical fantasy series about King Arthur's children, in the fourth book, I think it's the fourth book, Lilith's Love, I have scenes that take place in Istanbul. So I got on a plane and I went to Turkey and I explored Istanbul, and I have all kinds of great descriptions from firsthand experience of what Istanbul looks like. And hey, it's a business expense. I went and did a research trip, I also have scenes that take place in Romania. I went to Romania last year, but after I wrote the book that's set in Romania. So, but I read a lot about Romania, even though I didn't go there. I also have scenes that take place in France, and I have characters who are like researching the past, and so they go to the town of Lusignan in France to find out more about the history of that place. And I didn't actually go there, but I was able to go online and find maps of the town, and even like aerial views of what the city looks like. So, and the street names. And so I could plant these historical details or these physical geographical details into my storyline to make it seem real and make it seem more historical. So I definitely think you should visit the places that you write about. Now, if you want to go into the next slide, Victor. So this is a little bit about my my process in terms of writing history. Like I said, I'm very old-fashioned. I use notebooks. This is a page of one of my notebooks from writing the Caboggum book. And you can see up in the corner, I put the date of my notes when I took the notes. That name Cole that's written on the top of the page, what I'm doing there is I'm indexing my notebook. So I know that all these pages have to do with my reading notes from the book by Cole, who was a German visitor who visited the UP and wrote a book, Life Among the Ojibways, in I think 1855. And then obviously you can see my notes are in there, but these numbers on the side are the page numbers of where those notes came from. So for example, that first one, I wrote a note based on what I found on page 275 of Cole's book. And then the next one is 284 of Cole's book. It says French introduced Ojibwa to tobacco on page 284. So, some of this information, I write down anything that I think may be of use in my notebook. You can see that I have a star there next to the first one. So that's something that as I'm reading, I'm thinking, oh, this is going to be a really important point. So I put a star next to it. You can see at the bottom of the screen there in the margin, it says maybe quote this. So there's a comment there. It's probably not an actual word for word quote that I wrote there, just a summary of it, but I have a page number there telling me where the quote is if I want to go back and find it. As for quotes, I usually have found that if it's a short quote, I will write in my notebook. If it's a long quote, I won't. I'll just write, quote about this, page, whatever. And then I'll go back later and find it when I'm putting the notes all together. I have 3 full spiral notebooks of notes for the Kabagam book. So I read lots and lots and lots of books. And I read, and a lot of it is other sources as well. Victor, do you want to go on to the next slide, please? Okay, so these are just some examples of my sources for the Kabagam book. So you can see I have a stack of books. That big, thick white one in the middle is the Cole book that I was just talking about. The one standing up there is Ojibwa Narratives, and those are stories that Chief Kabagam told to Homer Kidder, and Homer Kidder wrote them all down. It's the only full-length book that was published about Chief Kabagam prior to mine. But you can see there are a bunch of other books, and this is just a very small number of them. I have probably 3-4 times that many just in my personal collection, not counting all the ones in the libraries that I read. That first one on the very top is a biography of Philo Everett, who was the head of the Jackson Mining Company, and Chief Kabagam's father-in-law, Chief Majigisik, was the one that led Everett to where the iron ore was buried in Nagani. So of course I needed to know everything I could about that. The next book, The Invasion, that one is about the Sioux and the coming of white people to the Sioux, and especially about the Johnston family. And if you can see that one with the swirl on it, that's a very old book. It's a biography of Peter White, who was Chief Kabagam's very good friend and one of the philanthropists of Marquette. So, and right below that, there's the history of the Ojibwa people. So there's just lots of books, lots of different topics, all relevant. If you look on the right of the screen, at the bottom there, there's a document. That's a legal document. I think that is a legal document from the trial. Kabagam's wife, Charlotte, she ended up suing the Jackson Company because they had given her father some shares in the mine and she wanted the money and they were refusing to honor it. And so that's one of the documents from the trial that I found, which is over at the NMU archives. And then on the right, you can see there's some newspaper articles there. That top one was in the Mining Journal about a year ago. It's about Chief Majigisik, and it was written by Adam Berger at the Marquette Regional History Center. And then below that, you can see another article which is photocopied. And that one is an article called Memories at the Sioux. And it was written probably around 1900. And I found that in Peter White's scrapbooks, which they have at the Marquette Regional History Center. And that man there, whose face you see, he was actually Chief Kabagam's brother-in-law, and he was a member of the US Congress, of all things. So, I mean, that just blew me away when I discovered that Kabagam's sister actually married a white man who became a congressman. I mean, I just think that's an amazing, amazing story. And I would not have known as much about him if I hadn't gone through Peter White's scrapbooks and found these things that Peter White had saved, which I never would have tracked down in a newspaper on my own. It's just too much work to try to go through newspapers and find things, and who knows where it would have been. You know, I think it was in probably the Sioux Evening News on some date. So you just have to look for all the resources you possibly can. I spent probably almost every Saturday for a year or so over at the Marquette Regional History Center doing research. and constantly going back and checking and rechecking and double checking things and asking them to photocopy things for me and taking notes. And in terms of determining what to research or what to take notes on, what to keep, most of the time I'm a note taker. I'll just write things down. But sometimes you find an article like this one about Memories of the Sioux, and there's no way you're going to sit and take notes on the whole thing. It's just easier to have them photocopy it for you so you can bring it home and have it to look at and refer back to. The bane of my existence is when I take notes and I forget to write down a page number or something, and then I have to go back and try to find it. And you know, you can just lose hours of time trying to find just one little detail that you stupidly forgot to write the page number down for, and you can't remember, you know, where it was, or you forgot to write down your source. So you know, you want to be as careful as possible with your note taking. Okay, go on to the next slide, please, Victor. Okay, so after I compile all those notebooks, what I then do is I go through and I transfer all my notes from the notebooks on note cards. And this is a very, you could say it's a laborious process. It may be a very old-fashioned process. There's probably maybe a better way of doing it, but this is the way I do it. It's the way I learned to do it back in high school and college, and it's the way I feel most comfortable doing it. Now, Brandy has told me this whole note card thing, if you have the program Scrivener, you can do note cards on your computer. I'm sure that's a wonderful way of doing it. I do not want to do it that way. I much prefer to handwrite them out. These are not even legitimate note cards. I am too cheap to go to the store and buy note cards. So instead, I just take scrap paper, I get out my scissors and I cut it up into pieces, and I make smaller than usual size note cards, because a 3x5 or a 5x7 note card is just a lot of space, and I don't need that much space for a note. Most of my notes are pretty small. And I find that the less you write on a note card, the better. Because if you write too many things on a note card, you may have 2 or 3 things going on that note card. And then you got to remember to move that note card into another stack later to go into another topic. So this is how I do it. So if you look at the 2 note cards here, at the top, you can see, like on the first one, it says Cole 68. So I copied that from my notebook. It's from the Cole book. It's a note from page 68 of the book. And then I just have the note there from the book. And the same thing with the other one here. This one's a little bit different. That says Magnyagi 75. It's one of Russ Magnagi's books. And below that is the book title, UP History. I wrote the book title on there because I had multiple sources that Russ Magnagi wrote. And so I had to keep track of those. And that can be another problem, because you may start out with only one book by one author, and then later on down the road, you find other books by that author, or articles or whatever by that author. And then you have to keep track of what note came from which of that author's sources. So, and then I just have the note here, and this one is actually worth mentioning. Magnagi writes, the copper rush was precipitated by the first Morse code sent in 1843 because they used copper for telegraph lines, which was something I did not know, but that explains why copper was so valuable in the UP, because of the invention of the telegraph, and they were making the wires out of copper. So that to me was fascinating. So those are just a couple examples of my note cards. I have stacks of note cards, a whole box of note cards that I worked from. If you go to the next slide, you'll see some of them. I take all these note cards after I handwrite them all out from my notebook, which takes several days, honestly. I put them in categories or stacks, and I have an outline. I have a basic idea of what I'm going to write about. But as I go through the note cards, I put them into categories. So you can see here I have one 1880s move to PI, which means the Kabagams moved to Presque Isle Park. That's what PI stands for in the 1880s. So all of those cards have to do with the Kabagams moving to Presque Isle. That one on the right is all about missionaries in the UP. Bishop Baraga was a missionary. John Pitzel, he was a Methodist missionary. And then I have a little note up here, Native American responses to Christianity and Native American religion. I wasn't sure if that was a category of its own or it belonged in this category, so I stuck them all together and I could figure out to divide them later on. I have a whole stack of note cards there at the bottom, 1800 to 1812 war. I actually started out writing a whole chapter about white and Ojibwa relations prior to the War of 1812. And I threw the whole thing out. And I spent hours and hours writing it and doing the research. And then I just threw it all out because I figured, no, that's too much information. I don't need all that. We got to start with Chief Kabagam being born. That's where the story starts. We don't need all that back information. It's been written about in other books. It's too much. I had a whole chapter about the War of 1812 and Native Americans, and I got rid of that too because I just felt the book was getting too long. So you end up weeding your way through all your notes through this process and deciding what you're going to keep, what you're going to get rid of. Once I have all the note cards in categories, then I arrange them, and I usually will just sit down on the floor and arrange them on the floor and try to make some sort of an outline with them. I put them in rubber band groups, and then I put them in a stack, you know, like this, and I pick up the first stack, and that's chapter 1, and I write that chapter, and then I go on to the next stack. And once I pick up that first stack, I also then take all the note cards out, and I rearrange all of those and to make my outline for the chapter. And then I just page through the note cards and do that. And as I'm doing that, I'm documenting what the sources are for the note cards. The advantage and the reason why with the notebooks, why I wrote the author's names at the top of all the notebooks, the pages of the notebooks, is because once I get the first draft done, I usually don't go back to the note cards. It's very difficult to find the note card in the stack of hundreds of note cards. So it's easier to go back to your notebook to find your original, your note, if you have to go back and look something up, which more often than not, you usually do in more times than you want to do, but it happens. Okay, Victor, you want to go on to the next screen, please? And then I want to just spend a minute here talking about documenting your sources. Obviously, that's why I spent all this time making note cards and taking notes and documenting where they came from. With the Kabagam book, because it's a biography and it's the first biography of Chief Kabagam, I wanted to be as accurate as possible. And also, I'm hoping that my book is not the end all about Chief Kabagam. I'm hoping that more scholars will go out and find more information. And so I wanted to provide as much information as possible for people who are going to be interested in continuing the process. At the same time, I wanted my book to be very readable to the layperson who wants to learn more about Chief Kabagam, but really doesn't care about the nitty-gritty of where all the information came from. And so with this book, what I decided to do was to have both footnotes and endnotes. And I did that for a couple of reasons. One, I hate endnotes. I hate flipping to the back of the book constantly to look at the endnotes, especially when most of the time it just says something like Smith, page 38. And I'm like, I don't care. That is of no use to me. But then there'll be a note like that will say something like, copper was popular because it was needed to make telegraph wires or something. And that's actual information I care about. But it's buried back there in the endnotes between 50 endnotes that are of no interest to me. And so I decided to put the stuff that is actual text and actually of information as footnotes on the pages, so the reader doesn't have to keep flipping back to the endnotes, and just putting the actual sources in the back as endnotes. And I hope it works. I think it works better than having everything in the back as endnotes. And then, of course, in the back, I have a bibliography page. I didn't take a picture of the bibliography pages, but you all know what bibliography pages look like. And so I have all my sources listed in the back. And as much as possible, I tried to document them in Chicago manual style documentation. But sometimes you just don't know. And so you have to do your best to try to make it clear what where the source is, or how the person can find the source if they want. For example, at the Marquette Regional History Center, they have tons of folders full of newspaper clippings of things that they've preserved over the years, but some of the very early research people at the History Center weren't very good about documenting where those things came from, so they'd cut things out of newspapers and stick them in folders, but they didn't write like the Mining Journal, January 13th, 1912 on the article. So I would have absolutely no idea where this article came from. I don't even know if it's from the Mining Journal, and I don't know what date it came from. So in some cases, you know, I have, you know, the name of the article, and then Chief Kabagam folder and a 27.8 or whatever the folder file name is, because I don't know which newspaper it came from or where the information really came from. I just know that it's a document there. So you want to try to be as accurate as possible with your sources so that other people can go out and find the source and double check it if possible. But you can't always necessarily document things properly. If you want to go on the next slide, Victor. So I want to talk a little bit about fact checking. You can't believe everything you read when you are writing a history book. There's a lot of misinformation that gets passed around. Chief Kabagam has had a lot of articles written about him over the years. And it seems to be that every 5 or 10 years, the Mining Journal or the Marquette Monthly or some other local paper will think, oh, gee, it's time to write another article about Chief Kabagam for our readers. And so that person goes down to the Marquette Regional History Center. They read all the newspaper articles that have been written about Chief Kabagam in the past. Sometimes they plagiarize directly from them, you can tell. And they write the new article. And so if the article, for example, and this is not an accurate statement, but so for example, if the article said, Chief Kabagam moved to Presque Isle in 1881, and that article was written in 1950, someone in 1975 copied from that article without checking to see if Chief Kabagam actually moved to Presque Isle in 1881. And then that person wrote, someone copied from that article in 2006, and someone in 2018 copied from that article, and they kept perpetuating this wrong information. And it happened over and over again, and not just with Chief Kabagam, but all kinds of information I've found about Marquette history where wrong dates get repeated over and over because nobody bothers to go back and check the original sources. And so you have to be very careful. You have to go back and check the actual sources. And a lot of the time, you'll find maybe 3 articles about a topic. For example, the first railroad train that came to Marquette. You might find an article that says it was 1855, one that says 1857, and another one that says 1855. And so you can probably assume that the 1857 date is wrong, but you can't be sure because the second 1855 might have copied from the first 1855 who got that one wrong. So the 1857 date could actually be the correct date. So you have to check as much as possible to be as accurate as possible. Other things I would do, I would not just rely solely on newspaper articles or even history books. If you do rely on newspaper articles, go back and find the original newspaper articles. I was lucky enough that I could go back and find, you know, the newspaper articles about Chief Kabagam's funeral, for example. There were several articles written about him at the time that he died, and so those are much more accurate than something written today about him a lot of the time. There were lots of legal documents. There were one of the things I'm proudest of that I found was that when Charlotte Kabagam sued the Jackson Mine, there was a big issue about whether or not she was a legitimate child. And in the testimony, she said that she had been married at the Sioux by a priest. And that was very interesting to me because it told me that they were Catholic at that point, her and Kabagam. And as I said before, I wasn't really sure when he became Catholic. Well, I didn't know if it was because he was Catholic or she was Catholic, and I'm still not really clear on that. But the fact that they were married by a priest sort of legitimized her marriage to him in the eyes of the white court at the time. And this was accepted as court evidence, actually, but yet nobody bothered to go and look to find out if they actually had been married by a priest. Well, I went and I looked, and I actually found their marriage record, which amazed me that it even existed, but it actually was there from, I think, 1846 at the Chippewa County Courthouse. And so I was really proud to have found that, and I thought that it was really important because we know that they came to Marquette after they were married, they said. And so I knew that they came here sometime after 1846. That gave me that a firmer hold on what day they came to Marquette. Just some other points here. I talk about having a second, third set of eyes. I think it's very important to ask other people to read your manuscript. People who are knowledgeable about the topic, but maybe also people just to proofread it. And I did have some people look at it who gave me some feedback on different things. Some of it was spelling of Native American names. Some of it were some facts that I got wrong, or dates or things that they thought I should double check. And then the final thing there is take into account different viewpoints. So depending on what you're writing about, realize that everybody is prejudiced about something. And I'm not talking about racial prejudice, even though I'm writing about Native Americans here. I'm talking about, well, me, for example, in writing about my own family history a lot of the time, I could be very tempted to act like my ancestors were the big shots in early Marquette history, which they by no means were, but I could try to claim that. And so you have to take into account who's writing the book. That biography about Philo Everett that I mentioned earlier, it's written by his great-grandson, who kind of wants to claim that Philo Everett is the real founder of Marquette, as opposed to Amos Harlow, who is usually considered to be the founder of Marquette. So you have to take that into consideration. And I tried in writing my book about Kabagam to consider the difference between, is this the white viewpoint? Is this a Native American viewpoint? Is it, just the different sides of the story, especially anything that's controversial or anything, where you have definitely two sides to a story. So keep all those things in mind. And then go on the next slide, Victor. No one's perfect, so I would say expect to make mistakes. I'm sure that there are mistakes in my book somewhere. I've had people who, most of you are writers yourself, and you probably know this. People love to point out an error to you. They get some high off of it. So be aware that probably someone will point out an error to you. Don't make a big deal out of it. Just keep a list of your errors. You can always fix them for future editions. So accept them. Like I said, I don't think my Caboggum book is the end all be all of all books. So I'm sure that there may be documents out there that are going to show that something I assumed or concluded is not correct. That's fine. I'm happy to be part of the process to getting closer to the truth about who Chief Caboggum was. All right, and go on to the last slide. I think it's the last one. And then just celebrate. I mean, I spent 3 years writing a book about Chief Caboggum. So that's his grave there at Presque Isle Park. And so I'm just gonna say, pat yourself on the back that you did it, and that you kept at it. And I'll just say I wrote this book through my brother dying last year, which just immobilized me for weeks and just made it very difficult to even go forward. I worked on it through the pandemic. I worked on it when, through blizzards and storms, and even when it meant taking another trip to the zoo to double check something. And, I just kept at it. I just didn't give up. So when you finish, celebrate the fact that you succeeded. And I'll stop there, and unless I have questions. I was going to say more about historical fiction. I didn't really, but well, I'll just real briefly just say one thing. My main thing with writing historical fiction that is different than writing history, and it's true for both, is that at the end of the day, with history, you want to inform the reader and you want to teach them something, but you also still want to entertain them. And with historical fiction, you definitely want to entertain them. You want to keep that at the forefront of your mind. You are wanting to inform them, but I think you also have to focus on entertaining the reader. And so if you're bored with something, don't bore your reader with it. I would say with historical details, aim for broad brush strokes a lot of the time. In writing my Marquette Trilogy, the first book, Iron Pioneers, I spent a lot of time reading about the history of the discovery of iron ore and the whole process of making iron ore, melting it down and making blooms and making pellets and dumping it onto ore docks and ships and shipping it here and there. And honestly, I still didn't really understand the process, and I found it kind of boring to read about. So I just kind of didn't fudge it, but was vague enough about it to get the point across without having to get into all the details. And I figured if somebody really wants those details, if my book really interests someone about iron ore that much, they will go and they will find the nonfiction books about the history of iron ore to read. So I'll stop there and open it to questions.
I have a question, Tyler.
Yes.
Okay, so you were talking about Endnotes and whatever. Okay.
Footnotes.
Here's my problem. So I'm writing history, and I'm writing it about certain family members, and I've been documenting. You emphasized always know where your information came from, which is what I've been very careful to do. Only now, I already have about 300 endnotes, and I have found that one of these families that I'm including is going to bring another 300 endnotes into the project. So when you're writing about family history and you're writing about these people who were a couple of generations earlier than yourself, and you're finding the information, the vital records, you're finding a lot of newspaper articles through different websites that have the newspapers for the regions they lived in. So where do you draw the line in terms of making an endnote or a footnote about how you know this stuff that you're telling.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on, I think, what you think your readers are going to want. When I wrote my book, My Marquette, I put a bibliography page in the back. I did not footnote or endnote anything. And honestly, it never even occurred to me to do that. I just wanted it to be a very readable book and not real research heavy. And so I didn't think my readers would want that. The book about Chief Kabagam, I think the audience will want the details. I don't think probably 90% of them will really care that much. They'll trust that what I got was right, but I think there will be a few people that will want to go out and do research themselves. And so I guess it depends on who your readers are. If you're just writing it for your own family members, I would probably keep all those endnotes so that they can go back and find those sources themselves. If you're writing it for, the broader public, maybe not so much. Maybe just list what your sources are and leave it at that, or provide endnotes for, the really important ones, and maybe not the maybe not as important ones leave out.
Oh, okay. So the answer to that is this will only be read by family members who are interested in our family history.
Mm-hmm.
And the other part of how this will be determined is I'm hiring you to be the editor. So you can tell me.
Well, honestly, Donna, I would keep all the endnotes. The thing is, no one is going to twist the reader's arm to make them read the endnotes. And probably most people won't read the endnotes, but I think it's good to keep them there to be covered. You can spend a lot of hours fixing your endnotes, and that's a real pain as an author to do. But I think it kind of boils down to, if a thing's worth doing, it's worth doing well. So I would keep the endnotes. You can find a very abbreviated way to do it. Just put.
Yeah, I already did.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You don't want to list your whole 3-line source every time, but I would probably keep them all.
Yeah, that's my instinct based on the fact that this is about real people and it isn't about made up stuff. And so
Right.
I want my family members, because this is much more of a genealogical record than it is anything else. And I want my family members who might be interested, and some are, to know why I said what I did about what a person did, when they were born, when they were married, when they died, what their wedding consisted of based on newspaper records. So I've been really scrupulously careful about making sure that all of these statements are endnoted. And that's my gut instinct. And it's good to hear you say that I should continue to do that. And I guess I'm just going to have to slog through with this one family, because this one family was so active in their community, and it was not a large community, and they had a wonderful newspaper. And I am almost to the end, and I already have almost 300 notes just from the newspaper, because he lived to be about 92. So he had a long active, and he never retired. So he was constantly busy. So.
Yeah, it is just sadly, that's the part of writing about history, is that sometimes it becomes more tedious than fun, as opposed to, say, writing fiction. But the other thing is that a lot of the time, those sources that you use, there may be something that you don't think is significant, so you don't mention it in your writing. But somebody else goes back and looks at it, and there's something there that they will find is significant. And if you didn't document that source, they may never have known that source existed. And so, you're just a link in the chain to future generations who are going to go back and look at it, hopefully. 200 years from now, they're going to be singing your praises that you took the time to do all that work.
And yours.
Hopefully, yeah. All right, but yeah, that's an excellent question.
Deb, you've got a question.
Yes, Tyler, did you find yourself being totally frustrated while everything was closed down and you couldn't go to all of those sites to do your on-site research?
Well, honestly, all my research was pretty much done by the time the pandemic started, so I was lucky. There was only one thing that I really wanted to go, and there were two counties. There's a mysterious person who there was a newspaper article I found that said that the Kabbagums adopted a white child, and this white child grew up to fight in the Civil War, and then he died of a gunshot wound while getting out of his boat at a train after the war. And it did not name who this person was. And I went and I looked through all the death records that I could find in Elgin County and Marquette County, but I wanted to go to the actual courthouse in Elgin County and also in Schoolcraft County, because Elgin was part of Schoolcraft back in the 1800s before it became its own county. And I wanted to go and look through all those death records and see if I could find out who this person was. And I just never got there. But I honestly don't think I would have found the record anyway. That was like the only thing I had left to do. So when the pandemic came, I just decided I'll put a note in the book and say, look, the chance that this record exists is probably never going to be found.
Yeah, I just wondered because you were talking about that, and I know I experienced a huge amount of frustration throughout the spring and summer when I needed to get places and could not go there.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, a lot of libraries will find things for you and email them to you or make copies for you or whatever, but sometimes you just have to go. I mean, there's no way that you can find everything or rely on another person to do it. I mean, you want to hope that that person is thorough in looking for things for you, but you never know for sure until you go to the place yourself.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right, other questions from the floor? Don't be shy.
I have a question.
Go ahead,
Yes.
Carol.
Well, I'm hesitant to ask because I'm very new. Just through this COVID experience, I've written, it's like a short story. It's about a Native American legend that's been passed down in our family for a couple hundred years.
Mm-hmm.
But my question is this, and you probably all know the answer, but I'm just curious. When when you're actually telling information about a historical place, I mentioned in this book, it's about a tourist attraction in the UP, and it describing it, like, I see the description of this place in numerous sources. Now, do I need to footnote that, or is that considered just general knowledge when you describe it factually, like the size of it and
yeah, if it's a fictional story that you're writing, or you know, I don't think you need to footnote anything. I mean, if you want to, I suppose that you could, but it kind of detracts from the whole suspension of disbelief and the fiction's telling of the story. And anything that is a fact that's easy to find, you know, you don't really have to document that. Like if I say, you know, the American Revolution started in 1775. I mean, that's something that anybody could easily find. There's no reason why I need to footnote that. And which footnote, I mean, what source would I list? There's 8,000 sources.
Well,
that will tell
that's
you
my question. And it's about Indian Lake area in the UP where I live in Manistee. And I'm describing Indian Lake, but I found the description in numerous sources. And I'm pretty much writing it like I've seen it, but I don't need to really document the source for that.
No, I don't think so.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're
Carol,
welcome.
what I've seen in some historical novels is there'll be 1 or 2 pages at the end where the author wants to tell you stuff about maybe how it was related to them personally or why they got into it. Or, I mean, you can put stuff after the story if you want.
Yeah, I do have like an introduction that tells that.
Sure.
And then I have an epilogue, kind of like a follow-up after too, which I have some of that.
Mhm.
But yeah, I don't really think I need any source footnotes. I tell where I heard the story and what I know, just my knowledge has that I've been
Mhm.
told.
Yeah,
So.
I think you got it covered then, and I wouldn't try to blend history and fiction too much in terms of documenting things.
Yeah. Okay, that answers my question. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Anybody else?
I have a question for you, Tyler. This is, well, something I know for myself, but comes up a lot when I edit for other people. How detailed do you make your outlines? Because I know some people want to essentially write sentence by sentence. But how, some people do a word, a chapter.
Yeah, my outlines are not very detailed at all. And I don't ever even probably make a complete outline. In terms of writing novels, I barely make outlines. I make lists. Sometimes I've actually used spreadsheets where I'll type in events that are going to happen in the novel, and then I can move them around as I see fit, which is kind of like using note cards. As far as like the Kabagam book, I didn't actually have an outline. My outline was my note cards. As I went through the note cards and I arranged them, that became the outline. So yeah, mine are not that detailed, but you know, everybody is different and feels comfortable in doing it different ways.
Yeah, when I'm working with nonfiction authors in general, I tell them 3 pages. Don't make, that's your goal for the outline.
Yeah, I think that's
Yeah.
reasonable. I mean, mine are probably 1 to 3 pages. If I get that far, I wouldn't do anything over that.
Yeah, I've told other people that have gotten hung up on their outline where it's like, oh, I don't hit everything on my outline, or my outline's not detailed enough. And since we have a lot of new writers, and that I thought that would be one thing to, since you mentioned it early on, that it's not a set in stone thing or set in
No.
length.
No, I don't think anything is set in stone, honestly. I'm very fluid about stuff, so. Any more questions? Yes.
Yeah. Am I coming through?
Yep, go ahead, Craig.
Yes.
We hear you.
Thanks. Tyler, did you do any interviews, or how do you keep a recording, or do you transcribe, or did you run into any of that when you were doing your research?
The book I've done the most interviews with was when I wrote the Haunted Marquette book. I went and I interviewed people who claimed that they had experienced ghosts in their houses. And with those, I did record all of those so I could listen back to them later. I was very concerned about being accurate with quoting people because of the whole nature of the topic of ghosts and the paranormal. And I didn't want to put words into people's mouths. So I did record those, and then I tried to replay them and type them as accurately as possible. In terms of like my Kabagam book, there's nobody living who knew Chief Kabagam, so I didn't really necessarily so much interview people, but I did meet with some people. I met with a descendant of Chief Madash, who was Kabagam's, he would have been Charlotte Kabagam's cousin, or her uncle, and then his descendants would be her cousins. So in those cases, I didn't like record things, but I mean, I met with people, I talked to them, I took notes as I was talking to them a lot of the time, or a lot of it, I also just emailed people and they'd write me back and I'd have those emails as sources to rely on.
Okay. Thanks.
So I think it depends on the project that you're doing. I mean, if I was going to write a book about, I mean, my Haunted Marquette book, the people I interviewed, they're living in haunted houses, but they're living in them today. So that part of the interview process wasn't really historical. But if I was going to go and write a book, say about Marquette during the 1950s, I would go out and interview people and I would record those. I would talk to people that lived in the 50s who are still alive and would get their stories from them. Or like family history, for example. If you're writing family history, like Donna is, and like I've done a lot of genealogy myself, I would definitely record those. Plus, it's just really cool to have, your great uncle's voice after he's dead on a recording. In fact, one of the things that saddens me is that since my brother died last year, I don't have any recording of his voice anywhere. I don't think there's one that exists, and I wish I did. I mean, it never crossed my mind to do it.
Yeah.
But it's a good question.
All right, we have any further questions while we have Marquette's leading historical author on the line with us?
There's nothing in the chat either.
Okay. Well, thanks, Tyler. You've been really generous with your time and sharing your war stories and the good and the bad of your latest book, which is fascinating because I'm halfway through it. I'm really enjoying it.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, and we'll make.
I'm gonna go
We'll
buy
make
your
this-
book tomorrow. Or is Chief come out?
Well, it's coming out on November 18th. Victor has an advance copy because he's the book reviewer for the Marquette Monthly, but it'll be out November 18th, and you can get it at my website, marquettefiction.com, and all my other books are there too. But
Well, that one
thank you for your
particularly I can't
interest.
wait to read because we're Ojibwa, my
Oh,
family.
good. Yeah.
I love reading that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you find it interesting. Thank you. Yeah. All right. Well, I'm ready to make this recording history if the rest of you are.
All right, thanks again, everybody.
All right.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Tyler.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Everybody have a good evening.